Hi, welcome back to my videos. This is video number 7, and it is a story from my childhood. I think one that has served me well through most of my life, and I'm excited to share it with you and give you a little bit of insight on it. Hopefully you'll learn something from it, and it won't be a waste of time. If it is a waste of time, I suppose I apologize for that. I'm going to call this video Beefsteak. Living on a farm, we always had food put up and preserved. Some of that food we put in the freezer, some we had in the cellar, some in the pantry. And as kids, we were the ones responsible for running to the bunkhouse, grabbing a pound of hamburger or a package of pork chops. We had an entire grocery store on our little farm. We could make meals for an army. And indeed, sometimes our family ate, I'm sure, a lot like an army. Things like frozen cherries that tasted like heaven on a hot summer's day. Apricot leather made from our apricot trees was as sweet as any candy really you could get at the time. I think even today it's still very sweet. Meat of all varieties, along with the top of my sister Tracy's wedding cake, which Josie and I may or may not have had small nibbles on, simply as a measure of quality control. Mom often pan-fried steaks from our freezer, and I had watched her do it many times. We had a bar in our kitchen, and we would sit and do homework or read a book and visit as she would prepare dinner. A little flour on the outside, some oil in the skillet, and away you go. You got steak in 10 minutes, and that was wonderful. At least that was my tentative understanding of the process. So when I came home from school one day, famished from the exhortation in the halls of academia, I knew just the thing to address my hunger. I would cook my own T-bone as a nice dinner pregame or warm-up. It'd give us a little something to tide me over those 2 hours that seemed forever. So I rushed home from school, rushed up the driveway, and I went out to our large chest freezer. I dug through, looking at the butcher-wrapped meat marked in red ink, hamburger, chuck roast. There it was, T-bone steak. That's the one I was after. Most of our meat was custom cut and wrapped, so the packaging had 4 steaks in it, stacked together like this, frozen, not like you get from the store where it's laid out so much. I would cook one up and I'd wrap it up, put the rest back in the freezer for future use. Seemed like an absolutely flawless plan, given that I had seen these steaks cooked so often. I went to the kitchen where I pulled the frying pan and set it on the stove. I wasn't exactly sure of the correct temperature, but I did know that I wanted it fast. So high heat seemed to be the best ticket. The ticking of the propane igniter, tick, 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 up and all the way to high. I had seen the Crisco put in the frying pan, and I was a bit conservative with the oil. I didn't know how much we needed. Not a lot, given that I had never really paid much attention to that aspect of the recipe and how important the flour was to the taste. I busted open a steak packaging, and I realized quickly that these steaks were frozen together and had been frozen together for months. And so I had to pry my steak from the others with a knife. They were still frozen as solid as a brick. I eventually got one to let loose with a little warm water and persuasion of a stout knife. Now came the flour. I filled a plate with a couple of cups of bluebird flour and dipped the steak in it. after it was wet. I will admit the flour didn't cling to the steak as well as when I'd watched my mom do it, but the steak was covered and I was hungry, so I figured, hey, this should all come out in the end. The oil was now bubbling fiercely, which I took as a good sign. Although there was only a little in the pan, it didn't cover the full bottom of the pan. It was mostly around the edges. I took my somewhat breaded steak and I placed it in the pan. Well, it was still a little too frozen to really place in the pan, so I dropped it in the pan. And now everything up until this point seemed to be going swimmingly. Selecting a prime cut, oil, frying pan, bluebird flour, all just like Mom did it. As the frozen steak slammed into the pan, the instant smell of burning flour reached my nose, and smoke began filling the kitchen. I started to think something might be amiss in my plans. I'd watched Mom turn the steaks, and it seemed a bit early to turn the steak, but given that one side had now charred all of the flour off, I turned it, only to be greeted with that burnt flour on the pan and frozen meat on the spatula. At this point, what do? I had to go on. So I flipped the steak, hoping that it would be my solution. But it wasn't. All I had done was a repeat of side one, and more smoke, and now the oil was splashing. At this time, I thought I could still eat it as is. So the black charred flour steak went onto a clean plate. Steak sauce abounded, but tragically, this T-bone was even beyond the powers of A1. It was completely inedible, partially because it was still largely frozen, and the bits that weren't frozen were burnt. And I had a mess to clean up. The flour was deposited in the trash. I scraped the frying pan as well as I could to remove the burnt on steak and the burnt on flour, and placed it back in the cupboard. And I chucked the T-bone out the back door, surely far enough to be out of Mom's view, and to give our dog Sunny a treat later on that evening, if it didn't feed the coyotes first. The remaining steaks went into the freezer with hopes I could figure this process out sooner rather than later. With that and a quick wipe down of the counter, I felt I was in the clear. As I often did, I overlooked some things. Now, if this were a modern day story, I could have used YouTube to show me how to show me dozens of different ways to prepare the steak, and likely would have had a better experience. But remember, this was the 1980s, before cell phones and internets and all of the things that those brought, and we had no such resource. Now, we did have cookbooks, but I could have used a recipe book, but it really never crossed my mind. I decided I knew how to do it, and that was as simple. It was a simple, straightforward process. I didn't figure I needed any more than what I had seen. Well, as the clock ticked by, I was without steak, sadly, but waited for Mom to come home, hoping everything would be copacetic. Of course, Mom came home after a shift at the post office, and her senses immediately kicked in. The faint smell of burnt flour and the suspiciously clean counter and the subtle mess on the floor were all dead giveaways. She knew exactly what had happened. And of course, I was the prime suspect, because Josie was probably telling me not to do it or was eating the top of Tracy's wedding cake. But to my surprise, Mom wasn't angry. Instead, she turned it into a teaching moment. She showed me the right way. Thaw the meat. Bread it properly with a little salt. Use enough oil to cover the bottom of the pan and cook on medium heat. Turn it once, and you'll have a steak fit for a king. She then taught me how to make a perfect gravy right in the pan with the remaining oil and flour. That single lesson has stayed with me my entire life. I have used that skill so many times, and I still think fondly of how one big mistake paved the way for a lifetime of better cooking. And that's the moral of the story, I suppose. Sometimes the biggest failures are actually the best learning experiences. Don't be afraid to try something, even if you fail. Even if you fail spectacularly. You never know when a little burnt steak will lead to a lifetime of delicious gravy. Thanks so much for spending a few moments with me today, and I hope your day is beautiful, and I hope it's filled with delicious gravy.